Hello and a very warm welcome to this joint Ofsted DfE webinar on changes to ITE inspection activity during the 24-25 academic year. My name is Paul Joyce. I'm a Deputy Director at Ofsted, where I have senior level responsibility or oversight for our ITE inspection work. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Rebecca Clare. Becca is one of His Majesty's inspectors and a senior HMI responsible for our ITE inspection activity. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Zoe Gingley from DfE, the head of DfE's ITT policy team. Many thanks to all of you for making time to join us this afternoon. And thanks also for those of you that have sent in questions in advance of this webinar. We've designed the webinar in the hope that it will answer the majority of the questions that you have submitted, but please do rest assured that any questions that we don't manage to answer during the presentation, Zoe and I will try and do so at the end. And if we do run out of time, or any questions that are submitted during this webinar that we haven't been able to answer, we will respond to in a frequently asked questions document that we will circulate after the event. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Zoe, who will give some context from a DfE perspective. Zoe.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We know you'll have read the announcement that the Secretary of State for Education has asked Ofsted to pause inspection of ITT providers and instead undertake alternative quality assurance activity called thematic monitoring visits across all phases of ITT this academic year. And Becca will be talking more about the focus areas for those visits for each of the ITT phases. This will ensure that a focus on high quality provision is maintained, as well as enabling the sharing of good practice amongst the sector. It will also ensure that all ITT providers in the next cycle are inspected under the same Ofsted framework. Since the majority of ITT inspections take place in the spring and summer terms, most inspection activity is expected to restart from January 2026. Planned re-inspections will still take place this academic year to conclude activity from the previous inspection cycle, and early career framework and national professional qualification inspections will go ahead this academic year as planned.
Thanks, Zoe. And now, colleagues, before I hand over to Becca to go through the main content of the webinar, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for responding to our big listen. Thank you also for the support that you provide for trainees in the ITE sector and indeed for the wider education sector as a whole. Thank you for your engagement, your cooperation and for your support as we prepare to make the changes that you have asked us to make as part of that big listen activity, and as we prepare to go out for consultation in January, where with your help we will help shape the future of ITE inspections to ensure they're fit for purpose and to ensure that we make the ITE sector as good as we possibly can. So Becca, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Next slide, please. Thank you. So colleagues, we hope that you'll find the thematic monitoring visits we're planning this year very constructive. As Paul said, we're committed to improving relationships with the sector and reducing burden and working together as professionals with a common cause, which of course is high quality education for all trainee teachers. And we've built that approach into all future inspection activity, including these thematic monitoring visits. So a thematic monitoring visit is a type of assurance activity that will involve teams of inspectors visiting providers to gather evidence in relation to specific themes for each phase of ITE, and will carry out on-site visits to a range of providers in the spring and summer terms, starting in January. Each thematic monitoring visit will last for 3 days within the same week. And crucially, we're not making judgments about individual providers. The findings will contribute to a thematic overview report. So there's no grade for an individual provider, no report for an individual provider, and no impact on any current grade. So the visits will have no bearing on a past or future evaluation of an individual provider, but they're a really unique opportunity for the sector, Ofsted, DfE to join together to produce a review of some of the most important aspects of ITE on a national scale. And the themes that we'll review, and more of that in a moment, are some of the aspects of ITE that make the most difference to quality. Some of them, like ITAP, are very new, and the information we can find and evaluations we make will be of real significance in building a national picture of what good practice looks like. We know ITE is a high-performing sector, and we know we'll find some really strong examples of good practice that we can highlight in a report that will be of use to everyone in the sector. It's a unique chance to use Ofsted's ability to take a national bird's eye view to share good practice, along with the reasons it's good and how that's been achieved. And of course there may be, especially in some of the newer facets, aspects where there's potential for improvement. And again, by writing a report on a national scale, without identifying individual providers in the body of the report, we can work together with you to identify where the difficulties are and what we together can do to bring about improvements. And we know that this approach will do a number of crucial things. It'll maintain quality assurance of ITE during the pause through routine inspections. It'll enable us to gather and analyse very rich information about good practice, and that will help with our inspector training on newer aspects of ITE such as ITAP. It will enable us to highlight, without identifying individual providers, where we can work together to bring about further improvements, something we hope will help the sector, since it enables us to identify any areas for improvement early and anonymously so that all can learn. It'll also help us again in our inspector training. One of the things the big listener responses asked for was improved inspector expertise, and we know this approach will be a really helpful step in that direction. So each phase has themes that are relevant to that individual phase, though you'll see some commonalities. And we plan to write one far-reaching report with chapters for phases that has space to identify any cross-phase matters that emerge. And you'll want to know what the themes are, so let's turn to those. So if we could have the next slide, please, and I'll go through phase by phase. Thank you. So in early years, how successful are the arrangements made by providers for their trainees to receive high-quality mentoring? And you'll see that we've got a focus on mentoring actually in all phases. How well do providers prepare trainees to teach children with SEND and to carry out their future roles and responsibilities in the early identification of SEND? And again, we have a focus on SEND in all phases. And the third theme in early years, how effective is the ITE curriculum in developing trainees' understanding of the learning and development requirements of the EYFS statutory framework? Does this enable trainees to develop the knowledge and skills to apply their learning about communication and language to their teaching? And next slide, please. I want to look at the primary and secondary themes. Thank you. How successful have providers been in implementing ITAP within the primary and secondary ITE programs? How successful are the arrangements that providers implement to ensure that all trainees benefit from the high-quality mentoring that they're entitled to? How well do providers prepare trainees to teach pupils with SEND? How effective have accredited providers been in developing partnerships and, where relevant, ensuring that they have sufficient oversight of the quality of education and training in their lead partners? So those are the themes for schools. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see themes for further education and skills. So here we've got how successful have providers been in implementing the Diploma in Teaching Further Education and Skills Qualification Framework / Learning and Skills Teacher Occupational Standard. And within that, inspectors will consider the provision of a curriculum that's tailored to a particular subject, the quality of teaching practice and placements for trainees, and the effectiveness of mentoring again. And how well do providers prepare trainees to teach learners with SEND? Emphasis on SEND continuing. And on the next slide, you can see two more phase themes. How effective are the arrangements for quality assurance and oversight between partners delivering ITE for FES in partnership? And where relevant, how well do providers implement the Level 5 Learning and Skills Teacher Apprenticeship Standard to enable trainees to develop the knowledge, skills and behaviours they need to teach their subjects well in the FES sector. So if we move to the next slide, those are the themes, colleagues, and we look forward to finding out more about the good practice we know we'll find. It's a high-performing sector. A few more operational details before we run through a few of the questions we've received. We'll send guidance very soon to providers and to the sector representative bodies. So we'll contact selected providers by telephone, normally 8 working days before the on-site visit. And all we'll ask for is timetables and numbers of trainees. We're not going to ask for any further information from you. We're very conscious of not imposing a burden. The lead inspector will work with provider leaders to plan the activities that will be needed during the visit, and that will include some visits to partner organisations and placement providers. And on to the next slide, we can find out a little bit more about what will happen during the visit itself. Each phase will have a small separate team of inspectors, and crucially the inspectors are carrying out inspection activities. There's no individual report, but it is looking at the quality of the activities. So the usual inspection activities to gather evidence linked to the themes relevant to the phase they're considering. And inspectors will meet with the provider leaders at the end of each day to talk through the activities. It's important to emphasise that these visits will be collaborative and professional and discursive. Just to emphasise also that the findings from the thematic monitoring visits won't impact the timing of a provider's next ITE inspection. So colleagues, I'm going to pass back to Paul and Zoe to answer some of the questions that we've had submitted in advance. Over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Becca. That's really helpful. And colleagues, I hope you found that helpful and useful and answered many of the questions that I'm sure that you have. As I said at the start, we've devised a presentation to answer most of the questions that were submitted. We have had some questions submitted in the chat, and there are 1 or 2 questions that Zoe and I will do our best to get through in the few minutes we've got left. But as I said, I assure you all the questions that were asked, so those that are coming through in the chat now, and the 1 or 2 questions that we've had submitted today, Becca and team will produce a frequently asked questions document and circulate that to all of you. So let me run through 1 or 2 of the Ofsted questions before I ask Zoe to do the same for DfE. So first of all, will there be any change to the inspection cycle? So the answer for that is there's no decision there yet, and that's likely to be something that we come out as part of the consultation to ask your views, and that's something that DfE and Ofsted will decide in due course following that consultation. Question 2 for me, will the sector have the opportunity to be consulted into feeding to any proposed changes before we introduce them? The simple answer to that is yes, and it's yes, most definitely. We do want to hear your views through the consultation. We are going to do some piloting activity. We will have some round tables, and Becca and team will ensure that your views are heard and that you do feed in to that consultation. Next, are all providers inspected for the same length of time regardless of size? I think this relates to TMVs, where Becca has said that TMVs will be 3 days. Well, they will all be 3 days. What we will vary is the size of the team, so the number of inspectors that we actually send to you for those 3 days, depending on the size of your provision. We've got a question here about inspections that are due to take place, re-inspections that are due to take place in spring and summer, and it's about what framework will be used. Well, we will use the existing framework, the framework that is current and published, the same framework that you were inspected under for your original inspection. So as Zoe said, it will actually close down the inspection activity under that framework. We've got a question about TMVs. Are they likely to continue when inspection resumes? The simple answer is no, we've no plans to do that, and I think it's unlikely we would do that, but we'll consider that in due course. And finally, from me, it's will TMVs be used to inform the timing of the next inspection? No, just to reinforce absolutely, as Becca said, there will be no connection between any TMV activity and the timing of your routine inspection, or any influence on that timing or anything that we do in relation to inspection activity. I will conclude there for time and hand over to Zoe. Colleagues, I assure you the few other questions that we've got about TMVs, Becca will come back out to you with a frequently asked questions briefing. Zoe, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Sorry, just checking I was off mute there. We've just had one question really on the DfE side, so I'll just take that one, which was around what that means for the ITT providers that are delivering training for the first time from September, and what the pause in inspection might mean for their first inspections. So, as was previously the case, new providers can be expected to have their inspection from Ofsted in their second year of delivering ITT to trainees. So for new providers entering the market this September, and also for those that began delivery of new quality requirements a year early in September 2023, this would now mean that inspection would take place in academic year 25 to 26. As Paul mentioned, we're really happy to take further questions. So anything that we haven't managed to answer today will be added to the FAQ list and circulated with the guidance on the thematic monitoring visits that Becca mentioned as soon as possible. And you can see on the slide here that this has Ofsted's ITE email address, and Becca and the Ofsted team will continue to collate those questions and share those with us at DfE. So please do make contact to ask any further questions or give any feedback you would like. And we'd just like to really thank you very much for your time today and for the questions that you've sent in, and would like to wish you all a very happy festive season, and looking forward to working with you all next year.
Thanks, Zoe, and thanks very much, colleagues.